On August 7, 1942, Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 1st Marine Division waded ashore at Guadalcanal as part of the first American offensive in the Pacific War. Leckie was a machine gunner with H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. He was 21 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall, 148 pounds, from New Jersey. He had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. What Leckie and thousands of other Marines discovered on Guadalcanal would reveal a crucial but overlooked aspect of the Pacific War that military planners had not fully anticipated. The Japanese soldiers they fought were physically smaller than American forces expected, and that size difference had consequences extending far beyond simple physical matchups. It affected equipment capabilities, tactical decisions, logistical endurance, medical outcomes, and ultimately survival rates on both sides throughout the entire Pacific campaign. Leckie served as both a scout and a machine gunner, roles that gave him unusually close observation of enemy positions, fortifications, and casualties. His duties required moving ahead of advancing troops to identify Japanese defensive positions and report back on enemy strength and dispositions. This meant Leckie spent more time examining Japanese fortifications, captured equipment, and enemy dead than most infantrymen in standard rifle companies. What he observed during those early months on Guadalcanal would profoundly shape his understanding of the entire war in the Pacific. The Marines landing on Guadalcanal on August 7 had expected significant resistance. Japanese forces had been fortifying the island since June 1942, constructing an airfield that would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia if completed. American strategists considered Guadalcanal critical enough to launch the first American offensive of the Pacific War there, committing the entire 1st Marine Division to the operation, plus supporting elements from the Navy and Army Air Forces. But the initial landing met almost no resistance. Japanese construction workers and naval troops had withdrawn inland when American ships appeared offshore, leaving the coast essentially undefended. The Marines secured the partially completed airfield, which they renamed Henderson Field after a Marine aviator killed at Midway, within 48 hours of landing. The real fighting began in mid-August when Japanese naval forces landed reinforcements on the island and launched a series of determined counterattacks, attempting to recapture the strategically vital airfield. These attacks, particularly the Battle of the Tenaru River on August 21, gave American forces their first sustained ground combat against Japanese infantry in World War II. It was during and after these engagements that Leckie and other Marines began noticing consistent physical differences between themselves and their opponents. The average Japanese soldier in the Pacific Theater stood 5 feet 3.5 inches tall and weighed between 116 and 120 pounds. This data comes from the official Soldier's Guide to the Japanese Army published by the War Department in 1944, which compiled information from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and medical examinations conducted throughout the Pacific campaigns. The guide noted that Japanese soldiers were small in stature compared with Americans, with short, thick limbs and an average height significantly below that of Western soldiers. The average American soldier, by contrast, stood 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed 144 pounds, according to records maintained by the Army Quartermaster Corps, which was responsible for uniform sizing and equipment specifications. Marines typically measured slightly above these averages, as Marine Corps recruiting standards during this period favored taller recruits. That created a difference of approximately 4.5 inches in height and roughly 25 to 28 pounds in weight between average American and Japanese soldiers. These measurements might seem like minor statistical variations, but in sustained combat operations across isolated Pacific islands with limited resources, those differences became matters of life and death in ways that neither side fully anticipated when the war began. Robert Leckie first encountered direct evidence of Japanese physical limitations during the Battle of the Tenaru River on August 21, 1942. His machine gun section helped repel a Japanese night attack across the sandbar at the Tenaru River mouth. The attack, led by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki with approximately 900 Japanese soldiers, was a frontal assault against prepared Marine positions. It was a tactical disaster for the Japanese. American machine guns cut down wave after wave of attacking infantry. By dawn, the attack had failed completely with Japanese casualties exceeding 800 dead. Leckie describes in his memoir Helmet for My Pillow walking among the Japanese dead along the riverbank and beach the following morning. He was struck immediately by how small the bodies appeared. Japanese uniforms looked sized for teenagers rather than adult soldiers. Equipment harnesses and ammunition pouches seemed proportionally smaller than American gear. Individual Japanese soldiers who had seemed normal-sized at distance appeared diminutive when Leckie stood next to the bodies. The visual contrast was stark enough that Marines throughout the perimeter commented on it repeatedly during the cleanup operations that followed. What Leckie could not have known during that August morning was that those Japanese soldiers were already malnourished before they launched their attack. Japanese supply lines to Guadalcanal were under increasingly effective attack from American submarines and aircraft, operating from Henderson Field. Rations were not consistently reaching forward units. Men who should have been receiving the standard Japanese Army ration of 3,400 calories per day were receiving significantly less, sometimes half that amount or even less, depending on how recently supplies had arrived. The Japanese military diet in the South Pacific depended almost entirely on white rice as the primary caloric source, supplemented with smaller amounts of fish, pickled vegetables, soy products, and occasionally meat when available. White rice provides adequate calories to sustain basic metabolic functions, but it lacks essential vitamins and minerals, particularly thiamine, vitamin C, and various B vitamins. Without adequate supplementation from other food sources, soldiers on rice-heavy diets quickly developed nutritional deficiency diseases. The most common deficiency disease affecting Japanese forces was beriberi, caused by thiamine deficiency. Early, symptoms include fatigue, irritability, and poor memory. As the condition worsens, it causes muscle weakness, peripheral nerve damage, leg swelling, difficulty walking, and cardiovascular problems. In severe cases, beriberi causes heart failure and death. Captured Japanese medical records from Guadalcanal, translated by American intelligence officers after the battle, documented widespread beriberi cases throughout the Japanese garrison as early as September 1942, just weeks after major combat operations began. The captured medical documents revealed a grim progression. Soldiers arriving at Guadalcanal typically weighed between 120 and 130 pounds. Within 6 to 8 weeks on reduced rations, average weight dropped to around 100 pounds. After 3 months, soldiers were losing the ability to perform strenuous physical labor. After 4 months, many could barely walk due to beriberi-related leg weakness and swelling. The medical records documented soldiers dropping from 100 pounds to 90 pounds, then to 80 pounds, then dying from a combination of malnutrition, disease, and complications from minor wounds that healthy bodies would have survived. On Guadalcanal alone, Japanese forces lost more than 30,000 men during the 6-month campaign from August 1942 through February 1943. Of those, approximately 15,000 died from starvation and disease. Fewer than 5,000 died in direct combat with American forces. The remainder died from a combination of factors, but malnutrition was a contributing cause in the vast majority of Japanese deaths on Guadalcanal. This pattern, established in the first major ground campaign of the Pacific War, would repeat itself on island after island as the war continued. The physical size difference affected combat capabilities in numerous ways that became apparent to American forces during the Guadalcanal campaign, subsequent operations. One of the most obvious was load-carrying capacity. Infantry soldiers must carry weapons, ammunition, food, water, entrenching tools, first aid supplies, and personal equipment. The total load varies depending on the soldier's role and mission, but it consistently represents a significant percentage of total body weight. The standard Marine combat load in the Pacific included an M1 Garand rifle weighing 9.5 pounds, or an M1 carbine weighing 5.5 pounds for certain roles, plus ammunition, bayonet, cartridge belt, canteen, first aid pouch, poncho, rations, entrenching tool, and personal items. The total combat load typically ranged from 40 to 60 pounds, depending on weapon type and mission requirements. For a 145-pound Marine, that represented roughly 30 to 40% of body weight. For a 100-pound Japanese soldier carrying comparable equipment, it represented 50 to 60% of body weight. That difference in relative load meant American Marines could carry more ammunition, more water, and more supplies for longer distances with less physical fatigue. Japanese soldiers carrying comparable loads tired more quickly, moved more slowly over difficult terrain, and had less remaining energy for actual combat when they reached their objectives. This became particularly significant in the jungle terrain of the South Pacific, where movement off established trails required constant climbing, descending, crossing streams, and navigating through dense vegetation. Eugene Sledge, who would later fight at Peleliu and Okinawa, documented this physical dimension of Pacific War combat extensively in his memoir With the Old Breed. Sledge enlisted in the Marine Corps in December 1942 and deployed to the Pacific with the 1st Marine Division in early 1944. He served as a 60mm mortarman with K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, seeing his first combat at Peleliu in September 1944. At Peleliu, the 1st Marine Division assaulted a heavily fortified island defended by approximately 10,500 Japanese soldiers under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. American planners expected to secure the island in 4 days. Instead, the battle lasted 73 days and became one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War relative to the size of the forces engaged. The 1st Marines Regiment alone suffered over 50% casualties and had to be withdrawn from combat and replaced by an army regiment to complete the operation. What made Peleliu extraordinarily difficult was that Japanese defensive tactics had evolved significantly since Guadalcanal. Instead of defending at the beach and launching counterattacks, Nakagawa implemented defense in depth using Peleliu's natural coral ridge formations. His forces constructed hundreds of mutually supporting cave positions connected by tunnels, creating a defensive system that maximized terrain advantages while minimizing exposure to American firepower. Every cave had to be reduced individually, usually by direct assault with demolitions and flamethrowers. Sledge describes spending weeks fighting through the Umabrogal Pocket, a coral ridge system that the Marines called Bloody Nose Ridge. The fighting was brutally close range. Marines advanced yard by yard against Japanese positions that were essentially invisible until they opened fire. Casualties were severe on both sides. But as the battle extended into its 2nd and 3rd week, Sledge began noticing something about the Japanese dead they encountered in captured positions. In his memoir, Sledge writes about finding Japanese soldiers who appeared severely malnourished. Bodies showed visible signs of starvation, even though these were soldiers who had been fighting tenaciously just hours or days earlier. Ribs protruded prominently through skin. Arms and legs looked skeletal, with minimal muscle mass remaining. Some bodies were so light that 2 Marines could easily carry what would normally require 4 men to lift. Sledge also describes captured Japanese documents and prisoner statements, indicating that defenders were on quarter rations by the 2nd week of the battle. With the island completely surrounded and under constant American air and naval bombardment, no supplies were reaching the garrison. Japanese soldiers were receiving 1 small meal per day, primarily rice, with almost no supplemental foods. Men who started the battle at 100 to 110 pounds were dropping to 90 pounds, then 80 pounds, while still expected to fight effectively from defensive positions in the coral caves. The caves themselves, while providing excellent protection from American artillery and naval gunfire, created additional physical problems for the defenders. Temperatures inside the caves regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Ventilation was poor. Water was increasingly scarce as American forces captured or destroyed the island's limited fresh water sources. Japanese soldiers were simultaneously starving and dehydrating in an environment that made both conditions rapidly worse. Captured Japanese medical personnel interrogated after the battle reported that heat exhaustion and dehydration were killing defenders almost as quickly as American weapons by the 3rd week of the battle. Soldiers too weak from malnutrition to regulate their body temperature effectively were dying from heat stroke inside the caves. Others became so dehydrated they could no longer function. Some died without ever being wounded by American fire. Their bodies simply shut down from the combined effects of starvation, dehydration, and heat exposure. The physical size difference between American and Japanese forces also manifested clearly in weapons and equipment design. The M2 flamethrower, one of the most important weapons for reducing Japanese fortified positions, weighed 68 pounds when fully fueled with napalm. It consisted of 2 fuel tanks carried on a backpack frame, a nitrogen pressure tank, connecting hoses, and a firing nozzle with trigger mechanism. Operating the weapon required significant upper body strength to aim the nozzle while maintaining balance, plus the physical stamina to carry 68 pounds of equipment in combat conditions. American Marines typically detailed larger, stronger men to flamethrower duty. A Marine weighing 160 to 180 pounds could operate the M2 effectively, though it remained physically demanding work. The weapon's fuel provided about 7 to 9 seconds of continuous fire at effective range of approximately 20 to 30 yards, which meant flamethrower operators had to approach dangerously close to enemy positions, expose themselves to fire while aiming and operating the weapon, then withdraw while carrying the still heavy equipment. 4. Comparison: Japanese forces did have man-portable flamethrowers, but they were significantly smaller, lighter, and shorter ranged than American models. The Type 93 and Type 100 flamethrowers weighed approximately 50 to 55 pounds when fueled, had ranges of only 15 to 20 yards, and saw very limited use in combat. The physical demands of operating even these lighter flamethrowers were significant for soldiers averaging 100 to 120 pounds, especially soldiers who were malnourished and weakened. As a result, Japanese forces relied much more heavily on traditional weapons like machine guns, mortars, and hand grenades for defensive operations. Heavy machine guns presented similar load challenges. The Type 92 heavy machine gun, the standard Japanese heavy machine gun throughout the war, weighed approximately 110 pounds with its tripod mount and another 20 pounds for a typical combat load of ammunition. Moving this weapon into position required multiple soldiers working together. For American forces with Marines averaging 150 to 180 pounds, moving comparable heavy weapons was strenuous but manageable. For Japanese soldiers averaging 100 to 120 pounds, moving heavy weapons required enormous physical effort, especially over rough terrain or up steep slopes. Robert Leckie observed this limitation repeatedly during the Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester campaigns. Japanese defensive positions were typically well constructed and intelligently sited to maximize fields of fire and provide interlocking support between positions. But once American forces identified and suppressed a position, Japanese defenders very rarely succeeded in displacing their heavy weapons to alternate positions. They fought from their initial positions until killed, captured, or forced to abandon the weapons. The guns were simply too heavy for weakened soldiers to move under fire while also carrying ammunition and other equipment. The size differential extended beyond just weapons to include basic tactical movement and maneuverability. During the Battle of Cape Gloucester in late December 1943 and early January 1944, Leckie's unit fought through dense jungle in extremely heavy rain. The terrain was mountainous, thickly vegetated, and turned to deep mud by constant rainfall. Movement was exhausting even for well-fed, physically strong Marines. Japanese forces defending Cape Gloucester had similar terrain difficulties, but faced them while receiving inadequate rations and dealing with widespread disease. Captured documents indicated that the Japanese garrison was experiencing significant malaria, dysentery, and tropical skin infections in addition to chronic food shortages. Soldiers who should have weighed 120 pounds were down to 100 pounds or less. Physical performance degraded rapidly under those conditions. Leckie describes watching Japanese prisoners being escorted to the rear at Cape Gloucester. The prisoners appeared emaciated, weak, barely able to walk. Many had visible skin infections, swollen joints from beriberi, and the 1,000-yard stare of men who had endured prolonged physical and mental stress beyond normal human limits. These were soldiers from elite Japanese units, extensively trained before the war, but their training could not compensate for bodies that were literally consuming themselves for energy due to inadequate nutrition. The physical mismatch also affected hand-to-hand combat, though such encounters were relatively rare in Pacific fighting. Most combat occurred at longer ranges with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery. But when American and Japanese soldiers did meet at close quarters, usually during nighttime Japanese infiltration attempts or final defensive stands, the size and strength differential was overwhelming. Marine after-action reports from Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa contain multiple documented accounts of individual Marines physically overpowering multiple Japanese soldiers in close combat. This does not reflect poorly on Japanese courage, training, or fighting spirit. It simply represents biological reality. A physically fit, well-nourished soldier weighing 170 pounds has enormous advantages over an equally skilled but malnourished soldier weighing 100 pounds in unarmed or close-quarters combat. Mass matters, strength matters, physical conditioning matters. Japanese military doctrine explicitly recognized these physical limitations and developed tactics to compensate. Training emphasized speed, aggression, surprise, night operations, and close combat where smaller Japanese soldiers could partially offset American physical advantages through tactical surprise and psychological shock. The Type 30 bayonet used throughout the war measured 20 inches overall with a Transit 15.5-inch blade, noticeably longer than the American M1 bayonet's 16-inch overall length with a 10-inch blade. This provided Japanese soldiers with reach advantage in bayonet combat. Japanese infantry training devoted extensive time to bayonet drill, far more than American or other Western military forces. Every Japanese soldier was expected to be highly proficient with the bayonet, viewing it as a primary combat weapon rather than a secondary weapon of last resort. This emphasis reflected doctrine designed to bring combat to close range, where Japanese advantages in training and willingness to accept casualties might offset American advantages in firepower and physical size. But even with superior bayonet technique and longer reach, physical mass still mattered when two soldiers grappled at contact distance. Once bayonets crossed and fighting became a physical struggle, the larger, stronger man had decisive advantages. Marine Corps training manuals from the period explicitly noted this, instructing Marines to close quickly with Japanese soldiers in bayonet combat, accepting the initial thrust if necessary to get inside the opponent's reach where superior size and strength could be brought to bear. By late 1944, the logistics crisis facing Japanese forces throughout the Pacific had become catastrophic. American submarines were systematically destroying Japanese merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. The Japanese merchant marine, which numbered approximately 6 million tons at the start of the Pacific War, had been reduced to approximately 2 million tons by December 1944. Most of that remaining tonnage was bottled up in Japanese home waters or operating exclusively in the Sea of Japan, where American submarines could not easily reach. Japanese garrisons scattered across the Pacific, from the Aleutians to the Philippines to the Solomon Islands, were receiving a tiny fraction of their required supplies. Many received nothing at all for months at a time. Soldiers were ordered to grow their own food to supplement inadequate rations, but most Pacific islands had poor volcanic soil, limited fresh water, and insufficient arable land to feed thousands of men. Sweet potato cultivation helped, but could not provide adequate calories for soldiers engaged in heavy manual labor, construction of fortifications, and combat operations. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations conducted by American intelligence units repeatedly reported the same information from different locations across the Pacific. Japanese soldiers were chronically hungry, losing weight steadily, growing weaker progressively, and watching comrades die from nutritional deficiency diseases. Combat effectiveness declined in predictable stages that intelligence officers learned to recognize. Well-fed soldiers at full strength could fight and maneuver aggressively, mount local counterattacks, and sustain high-intensity combat operations for extended periods. Soldiers at reduced rations became more cautious, conserving energy, avoiding unnecessary movement, focusing on defensive operations from prepared positions. Soldiers at near-starvation levels could man defensive positions and fire weapons, but they could not assault, could not perform sustained physical labor, could not carry wounded comrades, could not execute the range of physical activities that infantry combat normally requires. By mid-1945, American operational planning incorporated Japanese nutritional decline as a predictable factor. Intelligence estimates routinely assumed that any Japanese garrison isolated from resupply for more than 60 days would be operating at diminished physical capacity. After 90 days of isolation, combat effectiveness would be severely degraded. After 120 days, starvation would be killing more Japanese soldiers than American military action. This assessment informed American strategy for dealing with Japanese garrisons on islands that were not strategically essential for the advance toward Japan. Rather than assault every defended island, American forces increasingly bypassed Japanese garrisons, establishing air and naval dominance around them to prevent resupply or evacuation, then leaving them to slowly collapse from starvation and disease. This strategy, sometimes called island hopping or leapfrogging, saved American lives by avoiding costly assaults while still neutralizing Japanese forces through simple logistics failure. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945 illustrated another dimension of the physical size differential. Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months constructing elaborate underground defenses across the island. The fortification system included more than 18 kilometers of tunnels connecting over 1,500 defensive positions, including bunkers, artillery positions, mortar pits, and machine gun nests. The tunnels provided protected movement routes, allowing Japanese defenders to shift forces without exposure to American firepower. But the tunnels were designed around the physical dimensions of Japanese soldiers. Tunnel heights averaged 5 feet 4 to 5 feet 8 inches, adequate for soldiers averaging 5 feet 3 inches in height but cramped for American Marines, many of whom stood over 6 feet tall. Inside the tunnel systems, Japanese defenders had a significant mobility advantage. They could move freely at full height, while American Marines advancing into the tunnels had to crouch or crawl, making them slower and presenting easier targets. American combat engineers quickly recognized this tactical problem. The solution was to avoid tunnel fighting as much as possible. Engineer teams sealed tunnel entrances with demolitions, used bulldozers to collapse entire tunnel sections, and pumped smoke or burning gasoline into tunnel openings to force defenders out. Tank-mounted flamethrowers proved especially effective, pumping napalm into cave and tunnel entrances, filling the interior spaces with fire and toxic smoke that made them uninhabitable. Japanese soldiers either evacuated into coordinated American fire or died from heat and smoke inhalation inside the tunnels. These tactics were brutal but effective. They reflected American adaptation to fighting conditions where the physical dimensions of defensive positions favored smaller defenders. If American Marines could not easily enter and clear tunnel systems designed for smaller men, they would make the tunnels death traps for anyone inside them. This tactical adaptation saved American lives by avoiding close quarters fighting in spaces where size became a liability rather than an advantage. Medical data systematically collected from captured Japanese prisoners and examination of enemy dead-confirmed field observations throughout the Fall, Pacific campaigns. Medical officers attached to Marine and Army units documented that captured Japanese prisoners weighed an average of 108 pounds at the time of capture. More than 70% showed clinical signs of malnutrition, including muscle wasting, subcutaneous fat loss, edema, skin lesions, and various vitamin deficiency diseases. Over 40% exhibited symptoms of beriberi. More than 12% showed signs of scurvy from vitamin C deficiency. Survival rates for wounded Japanese soldiers were dramatically lower than survival rates for American wounded, even when both received prompt medical treatment. American medical officers attributed this differential primarily to reduced physiological reserves in malnourished bodies. A healthy, well-nourished body has substantial capacity to survive trauma, fight infection, and heal wounds. A malnourished body, operating near the limits of its resources, has minimal reserve capacity. Blood loss that a healthy person might survive proves fatal to someone already physiologically compromised. Infections that would normally be controlled by the immune system become overwhelming. Wounds that would heal in a healthy body become fatal complications in a starving body. Navy medical corpsmen serving with Marine units documented these differences throughout the Pacific campaigns. Corpsmen noted that Japanese wounded required less morphine for effective pain management compared to American wounded with similar injuries. Initial assumptions attributed this to cultural differences in pain tolerance or stoicism. However, medical officers conducting systematic reviews realized the actual explanation was simpler. Dosage calculations are based on body weight. A 110-pound patient requires proportionally less medication to achieve therapeutic effect than a 170-pound patient with the same injury. Smaller bodies need smaller doses. What appeared to be differences in pain tolerance were actually differences in pharmacological requirements based on body mass. Medical officers also documented that minor wounds which American casualties routinely survived frequently proved fatal for Japanese casualties. A bullet wound to an extremity that would cause an American soldier to be hospitalized briefly, then return to duty, often killed a Japanese soldier through infection or complications from blood loss. Malnutrition weakens immune system function, impairs wound healing, reduces the body's ability to generate new blood cells, and leaves patients vulnerable to infections that healthy bodies would resist. Japanese soldiers wounded in combat were dying from complications that reflected months of inadequate nutrition as much as the immediate trauma from their wounds. The Japanese soldiers who survived serious wounds long enough to be captured and receive American medical care were exceptional cases, not representative of the majority who died from their wounds in the field or succumbed to infection before reaching aid stations. Japanese military medical capabilities, even under optimal conditions with adequate supplies, were inferior to American medical support in terms of surgical capability, blood supply, antibiotics, and evacuation systems. Combined with chronic supply shortages that left Japanese medical units without adequate medications, surgical supplies, or even basic bandages, the survival rate for seriously wounded Japanese soldiers was extremely low compared to American casualty survival rates. American medical evacuation systems in the Pacific evolved to become remarkably effective by 1944 and 1945. Wounded Marines could expect to be reached by corpsmen within minutes of being hit. Corpsmen provided immediate first aid, including hemorrhage control, splinting, and morphine administration. Casualties were evacuated to battalion aid stations within an hour in most cases, where doctors provided emergency, surgical intervention. Serious cases were evacuated to hospital ships or rear area hospitals within hours. The entire system was designed to move casualties from point of wounding to definitive surgical care as rapidly as possible. Japanese forces had no comparable system. Medical personnel were limited. Supplies were inadequate even early in the war and became critically short as supply lines were severed. Evacuation was often impossible from isolated island garrisons under siege. Wounded Japanese soldiers received whatever limited care was available at their immediate location, then either recovered or died based primarily on the severity of their wounds and their underlying physical condition. Soldiers who were already malnourished and weakened had minimal chance of surviving serious wounds under these conditions. The Battle of Tarawa in November 1943 provided American forces with their first experience assaulting a heavily fortified atoll defended by well-supplied Japanese forces. Unlike Guadalcanal, where Japanese supply problems developed over months, the Tarawa garrison had been supplied adequately up until the American assault began. This allowed direct comparison of combat performance between well-fed Japanese defenders and the malnourished forces Americans had encountered elsewhere. The Japanese garrison on Betio Island in Tarawa Atoll numbered approximately 4,500 combat troops under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki. They had constructed elaborate beach defenses including concrete pillboxes, coastal guns, beach obstacles, and extensive trench systems. American intelligence estimated the position would require 3 days to capture. In reality, the battle lasted 76 hours, and cost over 3,300 American casualties, including nearly 1,000 dead. What made Tarawa particularly difficult was that Japanese defenders were at full strength, adequately supplied, and fighting from excellent fortifications. These were not starving soldiers struggling with malnutrition, but well-fed troops who had constructed strong defenses and were determined to hold them. The contrast with malnourished Japanese forces encountered on Guadalcanal and would later be seen at Peleliu was notable. Well-supplied Japanese soldiers fighting from prepared positions were extraordinarily difficult to dislodge, even with overwhelming American firepower superiority. The lessons from Tarawa influenced American planning for subsequent operations. Planners realized that Japanese forces at full strength in fortified positions would inflict severe casualties regardless of American advantages in firepower and numbers. This recognition reinforced the strategic value of the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping. If Japanese garrisons could not be adequately supplied, they would weaken progressively, making eventual American assault less costly in lives even if more time-consuming. On Okinawa, from April through June 1945, these patterns reached their final, terrible conclusion. The Japanese 32nd Army defending Okinawa numbered approximately 77,000 combat troops, plus thousands of Okinawan conscripts pressed into military service. By the end of organized resistance in late June, approximately 94% of the Japanese military personnel were dead. Fewer than 7,000 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner, and many of those were Okinawan conscripts rather than regular Japanese army soldiers. The extraordinarily low survival rate among Japanese defenders reflected multiple factors. Japanese military culture made surrender almost unthinkable for most soldiers. Combat was intense and sustained over 82 days of nearly continuous fighting. American firepower was overwhelming, but underlying all these factors was the physical reality that Japanese soldiers who had been on reduced rations for months were simply unable to escape even when escape might have been tactically possible. Soldiers weighing 90 pounds could not run fast enough or far enough to evade pursuit. They could not swim distances through rough ocean waters. They could not survive for days in the field without food or water. They could not carry wounded comrades. For practical purposes, surrender or death were the only options, and military culture eliminated surrender for most Japanese soldiers. So they died, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because their physical condition made survival impossible even if they had wanted to seek it. Robert Leckie, who was wounded at Peleliu and did not participate in the Okinawa campaign, nonetheless wrote extensively about it in his post-war historical works. He recognized that Japanese soldiers on Okinawa had fought with extraordinary courage while physically deteriorating from malnutrition and disease. Their tactical performance remained impressive even as their bodies failed. They held positions longer than seemed physically possible. They fought to the end with determination that American forces found both admirable and horrifying. But courage and determination could not overcome the simple biological fact that human bodies cannot function indefinitely without adequate food. Eugene Sledge, whose unit fought on Okinawa for the entire 82-day campaign, described the physical condition of Japanese dead in detailed, sometimes disturbing terms in his memoir. He wanted readers to understand that war kills in many ways, not just through bullets and bombs. Men died because their countries could not or would not feed them adequately. They died from diseases caused by nutritional deficiencies. They died because wounds their bodies might have survived under normal conditions became fatal due to reduced physiological capacity from months of starvation. Sledge writes about finding Japanese dead who weighed perhaps 80 pounds, skeletal figures that had somehow continued fighting days after most men would have collapsed. He describes bodies so emaciated that bones protruded sharply through skin, soldiers who had clearly been starving for months but had maintained their positions and continued fighting until killed. The determination was extraordinary. The physical reality was tragic. These were soldiers sent to hold positions that could not be adequately supplied, ordered to fight to the death while their own bodies consumed themselves, expected to maintain combat effectiveness while literally starving. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and August 9, 1945, ended the war before the planned Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands could be executed. Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945. When American occupation forces arrived in Japan in late August and early September, they found a nation on the edge of total collapse. The Japanese civilian population was experiencing mass starvation. In 1945, the average Japanese civilian was consuming only 1,793 calories per day, according to occupation authorities who assessed the food situation. This is well below the minimum daily caloric intake required for long-term survival, especially for people engaged in physical labor. Children showed widespread signs of malnutrition and stunted growth. Adults appeared gaunt and weakened. The Japanese military was in similar condition. The average Japanese soldier in the home islands weighed 119 pounds in August 1945, down from a pre-war average of 132 pounds. This 13-pound average weight loss across an entire military force represents profound systemic malnutrition. Soldiers who should have been at peak physical condition were underweight, weakened, and suffering from various nutritional deficiency diseases. Had the planned invasion of Japan proceeded, American forces would have faced defenders who were already physically compromised before the first shot was fired. The physical size difference between American Marines and Japanese soldiers was not the primary reason America won the Pacific War. Superior industrial production capacity, overwhelming naval power, complete air superiority by late 1944, and vastly superior logistics capabilities determined the war's outcome. But the size difference was a visible symptom of the deeper strategic asymmetries that made American victory inevitable once American industrial and military power fully mobilized. Japanese soldiers entered the Pacific War, averaging 120 pounds, supported by supply lines that proved completely inadequate once American forces achieved naval dominance. American soldiers entered the war, averaging 145 pounds, supported by the most powerful and extensive logistics system ever created. That difference, combined with America's ability to maintain supply lines across the Pacific while simultaneously severing Japanese supply lines, created the conditions that led to Japanese defeat. Robert Leckie survived the war. He was wounded by a blast concussion at Peleliu in September 1944 and was evacuated from combat. He returned to the United States in March 1945 and was honorably discharged shortly thereafter. Leckie worked as a journalist and author, writing more than 40 books on military history, sports, and other topics during his long career. His war memoir Helmet for My Pillow was published in 1957 and has remained continuously in print, recognized as one of the most honest and visceral accounts of ground combat in the Pacific theater. Leckie died in December 2001 at age 81, survived by his wife Vera and their 3 children. Eugene Sledge returned to Alabama after his discharge in February 1946. He struggled with what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares and difficulty readjusting to civilian life. He attended Auburn University, earning bachelor's and master's degrees, then completed a doctorate in biology from the University of Florida. Sledge taught biology at the University of Montevallo in Alabama for decades, becoming a beloved professor known for his passion for natural history and his dedication to students. At his wife's urging, Sledge began writing about his war experiences in the late 1970s. His memoir With the Old Breed was published in 1981 by a small academic press. It received immediate critical acclaim. Military historians, including John Keegan and Paul Fussell, called it one of the finest combat memoirs ever written, praising its unflinching honesty and attention to the grim physical realities of sustained combat. The book has been required reading at the United States Naval Academy and is regularly assigned in college courses on World War II history and military literature. Sledge died in March 2001 at age 77. Both Leckie and Sledge spent their post-war years helping people understand that war is not romantic adventure but sustained horror, punctuated by moments of terror, exhaustion, and loss. They wrote honestly about what they witnessed, including the physical condition of the Japanese soldiers they fought. They described emaciated bodies, visible evidence of starvation, and the physical manifestations of logistical failure written on the corpses of men who had fought courageously until their bodies failed them. Neither man wrote with hatred or contempt for their former enemies. Both recognized that Japanese soldiers had fought with extraordinary courage and determination under impossible conditions. But both also understood that Japan had sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to fight a war the nation lacked the resources to sustain. Japanese soldiers did not lose because they were inferior fighters. They lost because American submarines cut the supply lines that should have fed them, because their nation's industrial capacity could not match American production, and because their own bodies eventually consumed themselves when adequate food stopped arriving. The historical record assembled in the decades after the war makes absolutely clear what individual American servicemen observed during the conflict, but lacked comprehensive data to fully document. Japanese military forces throughout the Pacific suffered catastrophic nutritional deficiency that progressively degraded their combat effectiveness from 1942 through 1945. Multiple academic studies published since the war have estimated that malnutrition and disease killed more Japanese soldiers in the Pacific than direct American military action, possibly by ratios approaching 3 casualties from starvation and disease for every 2 casualties from combat. On isolated island garrisons that were bypassed by American advances, the ratios were far more extreme. Some Japanese units lost 90% or more of their strength to starvation, with only a handful of soldiers dying from enemy action. Islands in New Guinea, the Northern Solomons, and other bypassed locations became death traps where Japanese soldiers slowly starved, unable to grow adequate food, unable to receive supplies, and unable to escape. The 4.5-inch height difference and 25-pound weight difference between average American Marines and average Japanese soldiers reflected the enormous disparity in logistical capabilities between the two nations at war. The United States could feed its military forces adequately throughout the conflict, while simultaneously providing vast quantities of food aid to allied nations. Japan could not adequately feed even its own military forces, once American control of the sea lanes made regular shipping impossible. That simple fact shaped tactical decisions, determined survival rates, influenced the outcomes of specific battles, and contributed significantly to the overall trajectory of the Pacific War. This is not a narrative about superior American genetics or inferior Japanese physiology. Both populations produced physically capable soldiers. This is a story about what happens when one combatant nation maintains control of supply lines while systematically severing the opponent's supply lines. It is about soldiers sent to defend islands that could not sustain them logistically, ordered to hold positions that could not be adequately supplied, and left to slowly waste away while still expected to maintain combat effectiveness. The courage of Japanese soldiers fighting under these conditions was remarkable. Individual acts of heroism and determination were commonplace. Units fought effectively long after they should have been combat ineffective based on their physical condition. But courage could not manufacture food that did not exist. Determination could not overcome the biological requirements of human metabolism. The strategic situation Japanese forces faced was fundamentally untenable once American forces achieved naval and air dominance across the Pacific. The lessons from the Pacific War's logistics dimension remain relevant for modern military forces. Logistics capabilities are not peripheral to combat effectiveness, but central to it. Soldiers who are inadequately fed, supplied, and equipped cannot fight effectively, regardless of training, quality, tactical doctrine, or individual courage. The human body has physical requirements that cannot be ignored or overcome through willpower alone. Calories matter. Nutrition matters. Supply line security matters. These are not support functions subordinate to combat operations, but essential enabling factors without which combat operations cannot be sustained. American military doctrine today emphasizes logistics as a fundamental element of combat power, on par with maneuver, firepower, and protection. That doctrinal emphasis traces directly to lessons learned in World War II. Particularly in the Pacific theater, where American forces witnessed firsthand the consequences of inadequate logistics. The emaciated bodies of Japanese defenders on Pacific Islands became lasting object lessons in why supply lines must be protected, why logistics infrastructure must be maintained, and why feeding soldiers adequately is not an optional aspect of military operations but an essential prerequisite for sustained combat effectiveness. If you found this exploration of overlooked dimensions of Pacific War history informative and thought-provoking, please consider liking this video to help us reach others interested in serious historical analysis. Subscribe to stay connected with detailed examinations of military history that go beyond conventional battle narratives to explore the human and logistical realities that determined outcomes. We appreciate hearing your perspective in the comments section about what aspects of World War II history you would like to see explored in future analyses. Our community includes military veterans, professional historians, students, and people simply seeking to understand how wars are actually fought and won at the human level. Thank you for watching, and thank you for engaging thoughtfully with difficult history that deserves to be remembered and understood.